So welcome back. Here we are, part three of our a conversation. Good morning, Keith. We could probably engage in this conversation from now until we all retired, because that's kind of the nature of clinical supervision. It's something that's always ongoing and evolving. And today will be sort of the conclusion of at least this part of our conversation. And you do know that there will be another activity that we'll ask you to engage in as a way of completing your participation in this course. So I just want to underline that we'll spend time today going over what that activity is and what the expectations are. And in order for you to complete the course, you need to complete that activity and submit it so that we can then mark you as having completed the course, and then you will get your full complement of credits for having done that. It would be unfortunate if you went this far and then didn't complete the activity, because unfortunately we wouldn't be able to offer you any credit. So I just wanted to underline how critical that final sort of, and you all have been, really taking care of business and managing the mini activities that we've been doing. So I have every confidence that you'll have no problem whatsoever with this particular learning opportunity at the conclusion. So before we jump into the mini activity, I know Dr. Blackwell, you might have wanted to make a couple of logistical announcements, and then we'll give people a moment to check in since we saw each other last, and then we'll go ahead and jump into the mini activity that you were prepared for today. So Dr. Blackwell, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you had an amazing weekend. To add more information in regards to what Paul indicated around the assignment that you will need to complete at the end of this training. Also for today, you will need access to the competencies. Okay, so the competency workbook. You will also need your copy of the performance assessment rubrics. During our exercises, you will be working on specific areas of both the competencies and the rubrics, which will be posted in the chat when we get to those opportunities, okay? So you'll definitely need those for our next module, Module 5. So if you don't have them, just have them either in print if you printed them up, or you can have them available through your PDF electronically, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blackwell. So folks, before we look at the mini activity, I just wanted to take a moment to just check in. Any thoughts, any unfinished business, any comments or reactions about our time together so far? Anything that you want to put on the table or comment on in terms of your experience since we saw each other last? Carol, anything that you throw on the table just to start? Carol's like, no, I'm not unmuting. I'm not going to be the one to start that. Any thoughts, folks? Or reactions to what we've done so far together? Jared's thinking about typing something in the chat, I can tell. You can unmute too, Jared. It's all right.
No, yeah, if anything, I would just say I didn't realize the amount of models of supervision that there were. I figured there were, probably a couple models and specifics to those models, but, especially like the family model, the most was one that I didn't even think would be a model, and probably the one I leaned farthest away from. But nevertheless, there's just the fact of how many models there are that can be used in supervision was definitely something I learned.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jared, I'm going to make a wacky statement, and I'm very interested to hear what your idea of this statement is. And I sincerely, I saw that your hand was up, so we'll give you the floor in just a sec. But Jared, as you were saying that, I agree with you. There are a lot of different models. And the thing that I think is really interesting too is that there are going to be as many models of clinical supervision provision as there are people in this learning community, because you're going to have your own sort of blended or eclectic unique model, just like Jacqueline will have her model. So I'm wondering any thoughts you or any reaction you have about that.
No, it makes sense with, how many kind of types of, counseling we have with individuals. In looking at all the models, I can see how they, benefit someone with a patient, and kind of the same thing as someone with, their supervisee, a supervisor, two supervisees. So I guess, as many models as there are of counseling, is how many models of supervision there are. So kind of that made sense, but learning about it, kind of clarified it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's that parallel process again.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jared.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Sincere, so much for your patience. Thank you.
You're welcome. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Awesome. I think this study, this class work actually lays a perfect foundation for anyone who's just becoming a clinical supervisor. I'm learning so much just from, the lessons and everything, and it builds a foundation, because a lot of times if you stumble upon the wrong clinical supervisor, you wonder, where did you get your training from?
Right.
And so this one lays a good foundation for anyone who's starting out as a clinical supervisor, and a reminder of those who are currently clinical supervisors.
Yeah. And you raise a really interesting question. I love your example of, you run across the supervisor and you're like, where did you get your training from? And I bet one of the answers could be is they never got any training. And that may not be their fault. They may have got promoted into the position or whatever, but I don't know about you, but when I started as a clinical supervisor, I had very little supervisory training. And when I found this material and other material, it was very, very helpful. Jacqueline, thank you so much for your patience and your assistance earlier.
Oh, you're very much welcome. Good morning, everyone. I like that you raised the point about the counseling tips, whether we were even trained as coming in as supervisors.
Yeah.
As I was saying before, like I took bits and pieces from my other supervisor, especially the positive ones, and the ones that I didn't need, I left to the side. But because I became a supervisor during COVID when we were online. So no, I didn't have the training. And I think I took everything positive. I try to keep it positive in the narrative of the supervision.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it was very important. And I like that you stated that, like, we're not trained. Some of us haven't even been trained to be a supervisor.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can only do but so much. I love this because there's different levels of supervision, especially the comprehensive one that I've learned in this training. I love that one, and just the ladders of performance and evaluation. So I appreciate this training from you both. Thank you, Paul and Dolores.
You're very welcome, Jacqueline. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Nico.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, if there wasn't a training for clinical supervision, these boundaries and ethics that supervisors are held to would be crossed more often. So it's really good that there is this training, because like Jacqueline said, you just kind of walk into a position, you're ready for the position, you have your qualifications, but you're going to kind of, go with your best thinking. And sometimes we have to follow more guidelines, and it's good to have it.
Yeah. And our best thinking now, because of our learning community experience, is enhanced. And our best thinking is also guided by evidence around practice of clinical supervision, the different models and such. So we are building our practice. Yeah. Anything else, folks? Anything else you'd like to comment on before we go to Dr. Blackwell? Anything you'd like to say based on where we are at this particular moment in our time together?
I mean, I think everyone has brought up amazing points. And I think that was the original thought process of developing this training, is that OASAS recognizing that there are a number of people who are promoted into positions of clinical supervision who may not have received training. I mean, there's a variety of different reasons why that may have happened, but it's really about providing the foundation or reminding folks of what that is. Another thing I just wanted to remind folks is that this training, please make sure that you keep the certificate You keep a copy of the certificate in your personal files because you will need to submit both certificates for the renewal, but also make sure that you give this certificate to your HR department, because OASAS, when they do come in to audit, they are asking for these certificates, okay?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Blackwell.
Mhm.
And I'll just say before we kind of make the transition, and by the way, if you have any other comments you want to make, during the course of our learning community conversation, just feel free to unmute or raise your electronic or physical hand to make them. But I just want to say, I really appreciate the conversations we've been having in this learning community, because I want you to know, as a clinical supervisor myself, my practice grows every time I have the opportunity to be in a learning community. And I've been getting a lot from our conversation. So I want to thank you all for that. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our day together. And I'm hopeful that we'll be in other learning communities together where we can learn from each other. So thank you very much for that. So to these scenarios, we had Hannah, Evan, and Delyn, you may remember, on pages 36 and 37. And I'll just share my screen for a minute to share with you the questions that we asked you to consider when thinking about what modality or modalities might be best suited for these folks. And you may remember there are these questions, and these questions are questions that you can use. Thank you, Nico. These are questions that you can use as guides when you're thinking about a particular supervisee, about what may be, and it's 8 questions you may remember, what may be the best modality or modalities for that person. This is a concrete tool that you can use throughout your entire career. Now, eventually, you will probably be able to just automatically ask yourself these questions, or it will become apparent to you that, oh, this person would really benefit from this modality of supervision. And remember, folks, those modalities are influenced by the lenses of the models we choose. And as Jared mentioned, there are a lot of models, and we are constantly looking for what's the best way to support this particular supervisee. Now, for each of these little scenarios, Hannah, Evan, and Delyn, we asked you to consider these 3 questions. Which modality or modalities of supervision might best fit for this staff member? And again, your subjective take as the supervisor. How frequently should the counselor be engaged in supervision activities? And what are the needs, either stated or implied, leading you to make this decision? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So let me just ask this, folks. When we think about this first person, which was Hannah, and Hannah was on page 36. When you think about Hannah, did anybody make a decision about what either modality or modalities would best suit Hannah? And you can tell us what the modality or modalities are in your conception, and also give us the rationale. Why did you choose that modality or modalities for Hannah? And let's see if, thank you, Astrid, thanks for letting us know. Let's see if we can hear from a couple of people. Hannah was on page 36 in the participant workbook. Yeah, go ahead, Nico. What are your thoughts about Hannah? And again, if you could share your rationale, that would be great.
I'm just pulling it up on my screen, so I have it here in front of me. But
Sure.
for her, I said competency based because she wants to learn motivational interviewing, and that should be done on an individual session.
Okay.
Probably weekly, so she can learn that skill. She's new. I debated on whether or not to use like the developmental, but I think competency based because that skill specifically is what she wants to learn.
Excellent. So let me underline something here, because Nico is actually an overachiever and is adding another element to the I meant that in a good way, Nico.
Oh, I honestly, I just didn't know, so I just threw in everything.
Which is fantastic, because what you did is you also added the model, and you don't have to do that. We're just talking about modalities, but Nico suggested competency-based. He gave a very clear rationale as to why. And Nico, say a little bit more about why the modality you would suggest would be individual for this.
Well, because you need one-on-one, to really understand that and practice it. I think in group it would be useful to an extent, but it could get overwhelming. Too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. So I just think individual would be good.
Beautiful, thank you. And again, this is Nico, the supervisor, his take on this particular person. And again, Nico, thanks for also adding the model of supervision and giving such a clear justification as to why.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, Danielle, go ahead. I see your hand.
Good morning, everybody. So I also agree with Nico, but I feel like I'm an overthinker. So I'm wondering.
Fantastic. You're in the right place.
Like, do I have a senior peer, if you will, that's a star in motivational interviewing or not? Because that would be to whether I would maybe connect them with that peer if someone is really good using those skills, or maybe if not, maybe I would use groups so that they can build off of each other's strengths and sort of areas for growth. So I think without knowing more, again, I think I have more questions than answers, but I think that's how I would approach it depending on the rest of the team.
Fantastic. Now, I know Hannah is a fictional character in this particular book, but you as a supervisor, and again, I love how Danielle is also thinking about what are the available resources of our team and how might we employ the resources of our team, i.e. a star on the team. Now, Hannah, this is the question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, Danielle, Hannah's the fictional character. You're the real character. So as the real character, Danielle, are you an expert in motivational interviewing?
I don't know that I would say I'm an expert. I think I have really good skills because, and a lot of mine is because of my own training, but also from working with peers. But again, it's a little bit different, but a lot of the theories in motivational interviewing are going to be the same. So I think that would be part of it too. Like I'm all about, I know staff typically hate it, but I don't mind doing role play. I don't love it, but it sort of takes me out of my own comfortability. So that's something that I've used. I have certain staff that have taken me up on that and certain staff that have said, absolutely not, I will never do that with you. So I think there's value to all of those.
Agreed. And Danielle, the reason I asked you that question is because it's possible that somebody who is in our learning community may not have experience with motivational interviewing and be in the supervisory role and be responsible for helping that person to build capacity in that evidence-based practice. And again, I was kind of linking it to your suggestion of if you had somebody on your team, maybe not you, but if you had somebody else who had that expertise, it could be an extraordinary way to build on, their expertise and invite them to be part of that mix. So thank you so much for adding that. All right. I think, Sharia, I think you were next, and then Max, and then Nico.
I was just going to say, you already know I'm going to say all three of them, but I've seen specifically, like, because this talks about motivational interviewing, I've seen motivational interviewing do really well with like group supervision and peer coaching. Okay. I've worked at multiple agencies. I've been doing motivational interviewing for about 12 years. I've seen how it's like, changed over the years, as well as I practiced it at different agencies. So you kind of see how different people approach it and approach the training and ongoing training. And so I really like all three. I really like a supervisor who uses motivational interviewing with me in supervision so that I can see it in practice and I can feel what it feels like. I like the peer groups because usually they're led by folks who are pretty advanced at MI, and then you get to like practice with one another and bounce off of one another. And then I like group supervisions where like sometimes you might listen to a taping or you might practice together, and then you have like an expert kind of there to guide it. I think that has helped me more move forward with motivational interviewing.
Yeah.
So for like the company that I've been in now that does that, which I might be partial to it because I've experienced it so much, but the last 4 years I've learned more and advanced more in MI using all three of those than I had the previous like 6 years. So I think like, to me, I really like a robust way to approach it, I guess. So you could see it in different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I love the fact that you're also owning, I have grown more than I did in the past 6 years because of this robust method. And I'm thinking of Max and I'm thinking of Danielle, because Danielle, I heard you say, you know, you've had supervisees who said, I will never do that with you. I will never practice. And Max, I believe last time, Max, if I'm remembering this correctly, you said role play. No. So again, you could potentially have a supervisee who needs to develop this particular capacity, who is not as open to all three ways, and you figure out what's the best strategy with that unique person. Fantastic. Max, the floor is yours.
Hi.
Hi, good morning.
Morning. I agree with a lot of what's been said, so I'm not going to repeat those parts, but I said individual and peer, and I think that it's really useful when people are newer to have a lot of to have one-on-one time so that they can feel more comfortable like asking questions and really like build that relationship so they feel supported. And also, so in this like setting, right, it says that she's particularly good at building rapport. Like she has a really easy time connecting to people. So I'm like, okay, well, what kind of agency is this hypothetical agency, and what is this person's identity and lived experience and background, and why is this something that she's so good at? And being that she's so new and she's like really good at this, she also probably has a lot to offer her peers. And I think that anybody who's doing this, like having people in a group where they're treating each other like they're all on the same level, like there isn't somebody who's in charge, there isn't somebody who's a leader, there isn't hierarchy, that is like more conducive to learning and values the experiences that everybody has there. And yeah, I think there's like a lot that can be learned through years of doing this work, but there's also like, you can't ever get lived experience if you aren't like a shared identity. You don't have, like, if we're working with people who are homeless and this person happens to have experienced homelessness, that lived reality that they have in common, like you can't learn that. You're never going to be able to connect through experience. So yeah, I just think I want a lot more information, and I also just want to like have everybody be treated as equals in whatever their experience and knowledge base is, and like help each other grow and fill in gaps and just be like have a more well-rounded discussion.
And Max, I want to underline something that you said, because you said this, but then you went on to describe other things. The fact that a person can have one individual, based on their experience, their training, their identities, can have a very positive impact on their peers in a peer setting. And that's ideally what you want. That's the environment you ideally want to create when you're using a peer setting, is that people are really bringing to the table things that are having a synergistic and a positive effect on the people in that peer group. They're all kind of rising and being enhanced through that. So again, you're making the argument or the prescription for individual as well as peer. Go ahead, Nico.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what you're saying with Danielle, because thinking I didn't even recognize my own bias because I've been trained in MI and I've trained it for others. I've taught it to others. So I just thought, supervision, that's what I would do. But you're right, a peer, somebody else, delegate the duty if you don't know what you're talking about. So
Yeah, yeah, and use the positive resources that you have. Okay, so folks, we could spend this much time and probably much more on Evan and Delynn. But what I'm going to ask you to do, oh, Yvette, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So for me, I thought all the other answers were really good, but I went back and looked at the solution-oriented model.
Okay.
And one of the things it said was that goal setting through visions of future growth, and basically is focused on individual, group, and peer.
Okay.
And it said it emphasizes success by acknowledging and encouraging it. And then also the boundary profiling, which is rating herself on, her future growth or where she sees herself at now, Hannah,
Okay.
as opposed to as she continues to work with this individually and just setting a plan of action, but she can utilize the individual, the group, and the peer. I just wanted to chime in on that.
Thank you. Thank you for chiming in. And again, what you're also bringing into it, like Nico did, is you're also thinking about the model that could inform the modalities that you're using.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for adding that. So as I was saying, what we can do, folks, is we could spend this much and much more time probably on talking about Evan and Delynn. But what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to think about Evan for a moment. And I'm going to ask you to just pick, and we know that it can be more than one modality, and it can be all three, depending on your resources and depending on the individual. But I'm going to ask you to pick Evan for a minute, and I'm going to ask you to look at what you chose. And if you could only pick one modality for Evan, I want you to type your #1 top pick in the chat. What's your #1 top pick for Evan? And type it in the chat. And I know typing takes time, so I'm waiting to see what people type in the chat. Your #1 top pick modality. Okay, so Max says peer, Nico says group, Euban says psychodynamics, and again, which is talking about the model. Christina says individual. Okay, and let's try and get everybody to weigh in on this. And you'll notice, folks, you're not all saying the same thing, which is wonderful to observe and to note. I also, individual with group. So Carol's getting a 2 there as opposed to just 1. Okay. Yeah, Evan group. Okay. Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah. Okay. All right. Oh, individual group. Okay. So, yeah, people, it's hard to pick just one. I know. I'm asking you to do the impossible practically. Individual group. All right. So just as a way of concluding this before I hand things over to Dr. Blackwell, set Evan aside for just a moment, and let's focus on Delynn. Okay. All right. We got one more in for Evan, which was a group, but let's look at Delynn. And I'm going to let you pick your top 2. Carol inspired me. I'm going to let you pick your top 2 picks for modalities, and we're just focusing on the modality. Okay. So your top 2 picks for Delynn. Thomas wrote intensive individual supervision. Okay, and I'm not sure. Thomas, clarify if that was for Evan or for Delynn.
For Evan, because of the new problem that has arisen, it needs an intensive one-on-one.
And perfect. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that, Thomas. Okay, and now we have what's coming in for Delynn, individual and group. You can pick 2. individual and peer, peer plus group. Okay, thanks, Jared. Fantastic. Fantastic. Now, again, folks, I just want to underline, it's obvious to me and probably to your colleagues in the learning community that you went through a thoughtful and deliberative process to determine what modality or modalities you think are best for these individuals based on the very minimal information you have about them. The final thing I'll say about that is, and I'm thinking of Danielle as I say this, is that you might pick a particular modality or modalities for DeLynn, start that process, and realize, bingo, you were right on the money. Or bingo, you might need to make an adjustment, because it's about how the person is doing in that particular modality, and that reveals itself over time. So try not to think of it is that it's so fixed. You get an idea using the questions that we have, that helpful tool, then you make a choice and you test it out. And you evaluate it and the supervisee evaluates it. Okay? So it's not written in stone. It's a living, evolving process. Okay? Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Blackwell, who I believe is going to take us to Module 5 now.
Yes, I am. And thank you for that, Paul. And I just wanted to piggyback on something you said around it's a living, evolving thing. When we think about the whole premise of supervision, it is a living, evolving thing, whether it is the supervisory modality, method, whether it is any number of things in regards to supervision, such as the parallel process between working with a client and a practitioner, right? It is a parallel process, and that also is a living, evolving thing. So it doesn't change over time, or it does change over time. What we're going to do now is talk a little bit about some of the assessment resources that you can utilize to help you make some of these decisions. So right now we've talked about we've talked about roles and definitions. We've talked about the personal model of supervision. We've talked about the supervisory alliance. We've talked about methods and modalities. And now we're going to lean into just very quickly, not quickly, we're going to lean into assessment resources. Because if you've noticed, throughout the training, we've been giving you resources on how to make these decisions. So it's not this arbitrary thought process. It's about providing you with the tools so that you feel more confident as a supervisor, either beginning as a supervisor or reminding yourself of specific items that you might want to think about as you think about your clinical supervision. So before we get started in Module 5, which we already have started just with that verbalization, I'm putting something in the chat. Let's see, there we go. So in the chat, I have now placed the information that you will be utilizing or will be leaning into for the purposes of Module 5. So remember, at the beginning, I indicated that you will need your addiction counselor competencies, and it says addiction counselor competencies, TAP 21. And you will also need the ATTC performance assessment rubrics. We will be not leaning too much into it. We will be taking a look at this because you received this. And so now it's time to figure out what the heck is this stuff? But these are evidence-based tools to help you continue as you develop as clinical supervisors, okay? So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to have a conversation around this. Hold on one second. Okay, so you should see a transition to the slideshow.
Yes.
Thank you. Paul, you see it? Do other folks see it? Just want to check in.
I'm the only one who can see it.
Okay, so we're talking about assessment resources. And so we're going to lean into this material a bit more. And so one of the things I want to talk about is the individual development model, development model. And really, this is something that was discussed in the online training, okay? In the online training, it was briefly discussed, but this is also another tool to add to your toolkit. And so when we think about assessment resources, how do we assess the competencies of our supervisees? This is a great model in which to utilize. And I think, Nico, you talked a little bit about this that sounded like the individualized developmental model when you talked about the mixture of the models or modalities that you were utilizing for the purposes of the case study. And so when we talk about IDM, and I'm going to use IDM versus individual development model, there are 3 levels that we are going to look at, or 3 levels that are focused on. It's level 1, level 2, and level 3. So level 1, which is this top area here that you see the circle, that is self and other awareness, motivation, and autonomy. And those are 3 things that we look at in regards to IDM. Are folks aware? Do they have autonomy to make decisions? And are they motivated to do the work? Okay, so we want to think about that. And those are the 3 overriding structures that we focus in on the IDM model. Now, the other thing that you'll also see here is you'll see 8 domains, okay? And if you think about the 8 domains, a lot of that is focused on, what is it? The 12 core functions. Right? The 12 core functions, it's connected to that material. And so even though it's a little challenging seeing it on the slide, I'm going to let you know what those 8 domains are, okay? So we have intervention competence, right? We have assessment techniques, interpersonal assessment, client conceptualization, individual differences, theoretical orientation, treatment plans and goals, and professional ethics. Okay, treatment plan and goals and professional ethics. And remember, these are all connected to the 12 core functions of substance abuse work or working with substance abuse counselors. Now, while we have the IDM, we also want to think about, we have other disciplines that work within substance abuse programs, right? We're different disciplines. Some of us are social workers, some of us are case acts, some of us are mental health counselors, etc. And so how do we bring all of that together in a way that is thoughtful and helpful to anyone who is working in addictions, okay? So if you take a quick look at the TAP 21, which you don't have to because it's actually here on the screen, okay, we have something called the components of the competency model, okay? And the components of the competency model is located in page 3 in your addiction counselor competencies. And it's just simply this particular graphic. And this particular graphic gives us a lot of information, okay? So when we think about the transdisciplinary foundations, which you see in the middle, right? You see understanding addiction, you see treatment knowledge, professional readiness, and application to practice. The transdisciplinary function or foundations are across any discipline. So for example, if you're a social worker, you should understand addiction, right? If you're working in an addiction program, there should be a professional readiness. There should be the ability to apply practice, right? So that's across the board, whether that is a nurse, a social worker, mental health counselor, CASAT, etc. Then we have our key areas such as clinical evaluation, treatment planning, referral, client and family and community. We have documentation, we have service coordination, professional ethics, and responsibility and counseling. Those are all connected to the transdisciplinary functions, okay? So for example, as a social worker, I should be able to apply knowledge to working with clients who are challenged with substance use through counseling methods. Okay, that's the connection that you're seeing there. And so we want to be very thoughtful that our transdisciplinary foundations are the middle scope, which are, despite anyone's discipline, everyone should have those key items. And then we have very specific competencies that we're going to be looking at. And this is all located in your addiction counselor competencies, which we will be leaning into a bit more. Okay. So we've been talking about these competencies, right? You've heard about them. So what do they really look like? So if you take a look at, I think your workbook, well, let's see, I think it's in your workbook. This competency is in your workbook, but also taking a look at your competency, addiction counselor competencies on page 20, you will see this particular competency, okay? And you don't have to specifically go to this particular competency because I'm going to walk you through it now, okay? So when we think about the competency, we are trying to, when we think about how do we assess the folks who work in our programs through clinical supervision, right? We have to have competencies in which we're utilizing to assess, right? And those competencies are the foundation of how we actually assess folks in regards to performance evaluations, in regards to future training, etc. And so what do these competencies look like? So when you look at this particular slide, you see tab 21, the competencies, the K, the S, and the A. And so I'm bringing your attention to competency 24. The competency is establishing rapport, including management of crisis situations, and determine the determination of the need for additional professional assistance, right? That's the competency. When you're utilizing the addiction competencies, right? That's the workbook. The competency will be in blue, okay? The competency will be in blue, okay? Then we have the K, the S, and the A's. And this is how the competency is broken down, right? So we can have a competency such as establishing rapport in crisis situations, etc. But how do we assess whether or not someone that we're working with in supervision has the ability to thrive in this competency? So the K and the S and the A's have or provide us with the foundation to do so. So in this particular competency, right, we have a K, right, which is the knowledge. And if you look at this, you see the particular knowledge that folks need to have or should be exhibiting in order to fulfill this competency, right? So you don't have to guess what they need to know. You have it right here. So if you're deciding to work with a supervisee around crisis situations, establishing rapport, and the need to connect to another party to help in that process, because we know when someone is in a crisis situation, we may need to connect to a supervisor or a more senior peer to assist us in that crisis situation, right? How do we do that? So these are the knowledge spaces or the knowledge that folks need to exhibit in order to do that, okay? So you can look at that and use that as a tool as you assess someone's ability to handle crisis situations, right? The other piece of this is, so we have the knowledge that folks need to exhibit. We also have specific skills that the person needs to exhibit as well. Now, the thing that we want to be mindful of is that someone doesn't need to have all of the knowledge. Someone doesn't need to have all of the skills. And in fact, part of later on when we discuss professional development, it might be that someone has some of the knowledge, they have awareness, right? But they need to develop skills in order to do so, okay? And so that's going back to the awareness, the autonomy, etc. components of the IDM model. So these are some of the skills, or these are the skills that you can utilize as an assessment of whether or not the person that you're working with in supervision has the capability to manage crisis situations, okay? And again, you don't have to have all of these skills, right? But these are some very important foundational skills that you will use as an assessment, okay? So we have the K, which is knowledge, the S, which is skills, okay? What we know versus what we do, okay? The other component of this, and one thing I want to bring your attention to, is that not all competencies have attitudes, and not all competencies that you will see have skills, right? Because as you begin to lean into the competency workbook, you'll see, depending upon a competency that you may choose to work with your supervisee on in regards to anything, that you may not always see attitudes, you may not always see skills. The attitudes are the thought processes that accompany this particular competency. So we have the knowledge, we have the skills, and the particular helpful attitudes that are a part of this, okay? So what I'm going to do is just take a quick second to read one of the knowledge to connect it, one of the skills to connect it, and the attitudes to connect it. So it feels like this is not kind of like this nebulous thing, but it is really connected. So when we're looking at a particular competency, so Paul is in the process, I'm supervising Paul and I'm his clinical supervisor. And there has been a recent situation where there was a crisis situation in the outpatient program that Paul was involved with, right? Paul is a relatively new counselor. And so one of the things I want to look at is developing his competency around handling crisis situations, because we know that crisis situations can happen at any time. So rather than we have the conversation and it's like, Paul, I'd like to think about your thoughts around this particular crisis situation. Well, this and this happened. I think I was able to gather information, but I really got confused about when I should have sought out you or another person. Okay. And so one of the things that I would utilize with Paul in this competency is, one, explain the competency, right? And I would suggest that the PDF, that versions that you have, share that with your staff so that it doesn't feel like you're coming with this brand new information. I always suggest that you share it with your staff and introduce it potentially in a group supervision so that when you introduce it in supervision, it doesn't feel like, what is this information? Never saw this before, okay? Because like anything else, we want to make sure that the staff understands it, okay? So I would talk with Paul about competency 24, which is specifically focused on crisis situations. So we would look at the blue area. Then we would look at the importance and purpose of rapport building, right? Did Paul have that knowledge in this particular crisis situation? All right, that's the knowledge. And we lean into that. Did he have awareness? Did he have autonomy? Or he was really practicing it? Okay, he was motivated to do so, but really maybe became overwhelmed by what was happening. Then I'm going to look at the skills. So demonstrating effective verbal and verbal and nonverbal communication and establishing rapport. So not only did Paul have the knowledge of the importance of establishing rapport, he was able to, or potentially able to, exhibit the actual skill. Okay, and so we would suss through that and talk through that conversation and see if that was an area that Paul felt like he needed to potentially improve or not improve. Okay, then we go down to the attitudes, right? Now, willingness to establish rapport is an important attitude that Paul would need to have in order to establish rapport, to even get to the crisis situation, suss out what needed to be done, and to establish whether or not he needed further assistance, okay? So we have the K, the S, and the A. Now, remembering as we go further along in the training, we may not always see an S, we may not always see an A, right? But those are areas that we need to look at. And then also, when you are doing this, it doesn't have to be all of the knowledge, all of the skills, or all of the attitudes. You want to be very specific about which competencies you're looking at and which K, S, and A's you're looking at within the body of the competency. Okay? So now that we've talked about the addiction counselor competency, and in a few minutes, you'll get an opportunity to pull all of this together, so fear not, okay? You have the TAP 21, right? That's what we talked about. We leaned into competency 24. Now, how is this connected to the performance assessment rubrics, which is another evidence-based tool that was developed by SAMHSA and, of course, has been talked about, or ATTC and SAMHSA as well. Just to check in, can everyone please put in the chat that they have access to the competencies and they have access to the performance assessment rubrics? Just yes or no is helpful. And Paul, can you monitor
Yeah,
that for me?
I'm getting a lot of yeses so far.
Perfecto, because we want to make sure that you have access to these tools, not only for the purposes for after this training, but you will also be utilizing this later on in the training as well. Okay.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So you have the addiction counselor competencies and the performance assessment rubrics. So we spent a little bit of time talking about the competencies, and now let's lean into the performance assessment rubrics. And one of the things I always like to remind folks of is, as you're utilizing these assessment tools or these resources, remember to be kind to yourself. This is the first time that you may be seeing these tools, and so being thoughtful around preparation prior to introducing them to staff is going to be key. One of the things that I have found very helpful when I've utilized these tools is, if I'm looking at a particular competency, I have just that competency in front of me, and I have just the performance assessment rubrics in front of me. Because if you're flipping through pages, etc., it makes you feel uncomfortable potentially, and it also makes your supervisee potentially feel uncomfortable as well. And it helps to focus the supervision, which Paul will be talking a little bit about in a bit. Around focusing the supervision, and it can be a part of your supervisory agenda as well. So remember, we looked at a competency. Now we're looking at a performance rubric. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this, and again, you'll get an opportunity to lean into this in a few minutes. So this particular rubric is focused on understanding addiction. Okay, now remember, in the competency, in the TAP 21, you see the competency in blue. In the rubrics, you see the competency that you are focused on in gray at the top, right? And also remember, in the IDM model, you are assessing awareness, you're assessing application to practice, and you're also assessing motivation, right? So how do you do that? One of the ways that you do that is by looking at the performance assessment rubrics. So for example, we have understanding a variety of models and theories of addiction and other problems related to substance use. That is the competency that we're looking at, right? That's in gray. Then we have a continuum in which we're looking at to help to assess awareness, understanding, practice, and mastery, okay? So for example, awareness, how do we determine with the supervisee, because they're looking at this as well, how do we determine if they are aware of the practices, all right? How do we determine if they're aware? How do we determine if they understand the practices? How do we determine if they are actually practicing it? Okay, they're applying the knowledge that they're aware of and that they know, and the mastery, that they've got this down pat, right? These specific areas are covered here. So in awareness, this is how you exhibit awareness. Okay, so it identifies a variety of models and theories of addiction and other problems related to substance use, right? Then we have understanding, discusses. You see the slight change in language? It's not just identifies, it's also being able to discuss a variety of theories, okay? Then we have applied knowledge, which is apply it. So we are aware of it, we're able to discuss it, and now we're able to apply it, okay? And then mastery is when you're able to pull all of that together. Now, the other piece that you're noticing on this is in the performance rubrics, you're noticing two things. You're noticing, of course, the competency, you're noticing the continuum, but you're also noticing that there are two ratings, right? There is one for the supervisor and there is one for the counselor, okay? Now, this is very interesting because when you begin to assess, remember in supervision, this is a collaboration. So it is about thinking about where you see the counselor, but also where the counselor sees themselves in regards to this skill. So for example, you may see that you have an entirely different reading from, let's say, going back to the example of Paul, right? Paul may have a thought process that he has mastery, okay? He has mastery, but I may recognize that maybe he has an understanding of it, right? And so we're going to discuss my rating and the counselor's rating and use that as a part of the supervision content, the conversation, okay? And so this is another evidence-based assessment tool that you can utilize in regards to working with your supervisees in understanding and unpacking competencies that are related directly to their work in the substance use field. Okay, and remember, these competencies and the performance of rubrics are focused on not just the 8 domains, but also the transdisciplinary foundations, right? So you can utilize this with a social worker, utilize it with a mental health counselor, with a KSAT across the board. Okay. Okay. Next, we're going into a screening competency. Now, this is just really I'm going to say easy peasy rating form, okay? So when you look at the back of the rubrics, you will see a series of rating forms. And these rating forms basically concisely lean into particular competencies and the rating, right? So let's say, for example, we're looking at, hold on one second, let me get my clicker here. We're looking at competency 27, right? And if you notice on the rating scale, right, there are a number of competencies there. This concisely just puts all of the competencies in one place on the rating, and the rating is the rating that you and the supervisee have determined. So rather than having to go through the entire rubrics, right, at the end, you have a rating form that you can utilize, that you can literally identify the competency and the rating, okay? So hopefully that helps to concisely filter down some of this information for you, okay? Before I move forward, I want to ask if there are any questions or anything that I need to go back to.
Hi, this is Dion. I was just wondering how one handles discrepancies. I know that you said at the end that there'll be 2 different grading systems based on the supervisee and the supervisor. But if there's discrepancies in the rubrics, is it discussed prior to you getting to the other section, or is it just 2 various opinions and then that's just it?
Yes, it is. And this goes back to the and that's a great question. And it's a question that comes up all of the time, because we know that we have a different, folks have different opinions of their skill level, right? And so this goes back to the strength of the supervisory alliance that we talked about earlier in the training, really being able to lean into the discrepancy and figure out how do we address that in a way that hopefully maintains the supervisory alliance, okay? So there is no one, I wish I had a perfect tool to tell you how to handle that discrepancy, but remember, just kind of thinking and leaning into, we handle each individual supervisee as an individual. So what may be an effective tool in helping to handle that discrepancy or leaning into that discrepancy with one supervisee may not be an effective tool with another supervisee. Okay? Was that helpful?
Yes.
Okay.
I was just concerned about the, like you mentioned, the alliance, if there's not a satisfactory resolution, what that would do to the relationship between supervisor and supervisee.
Absolutely. And that's an amazing question to ask. And it's something that we come back to that ongoing evolving process. There are going to be times in the supervision process or supervisory process that the supervisor and the supervisee will not necessarily agree. And so how do we handle that is something that, when we talked about the conflicts in supervision, et cetera, is something that will evolve over time. Okay. Sometimes when we talk about the discrepancy, we may not be able to resolve that discrepancy, and it may rupture the supervisory alliance. But we as supervisors have the responsibility to take an active role in attempting to resolve that alliance rupture. Okay. It's tough sometimes. It's tough being a supervisor sometimes. Okay. Any other questions before I move forward? All right. Ooh, I'm jumping all over the place, so I apologize for that. Okay, so what we're going to do for the purposes of this particular exercise is I have placed in the chat a competency or a series of competencies that you will be utilizing. Now, remember on page 36, we went over, Paul did a really amazing job in going over ALEX for module 4 during our last session. We will be utilizing the information for ALEX, okay, the case study on ALEX on page 36 to just practice looking at a competency and connecting it to the rubrics, okay? What will happen is we'll break up in breakout rooms, right? And you're just practicing connecting a rubric, a competency, and looking at it in the competency and looking at it in the rubric. Before I move us forward, I want to check to make sure that that has been posted and everyone has access to it in the chat. Hold on. I am
Competencies 75 through 79.
Yes. So what we're going to do is a quick breakout just for the practice of connecting a competency to the rubric. Remembering you're just practicing one of those competencies, and connecting it to the rubric. We will not be doing a report out on this because this is practice, okay? And remember, be kind to yourself because this is the first time that you're looking at this document. And as you begin to develop as a supervisor or utilize it, you'll feel more confident utilizing both of these documents, okay? So I am going to say, let's do, what do you think, Paul, 10 minutes? Okay, a 10-minute breakout. And Clyde, can we put 10 minutes on the clock and break folks out in like 5 groups? And remember, you're just practicing connecting the competency to the rubric, and we will not be reporting out when you return. I'm going to stop my share so I can see what's happening.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Blackwell about what you're going to be doing before you go into the breakout groups?
So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for taking the opportunity to practice connecting the competencies to the rubrics. And so you've now had an opportunity to practice combining the competencies with the rubrics. Again, these are 2 assessment tools that you can utilize in your clinical supervision with your supervisees. That with the combination of also recognizing that while you're identifying the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes, that different supervisees have different learning capabilities or learning skills, right? Or they learn differently, as we all do. And so when we think about identifying the competencies and how people exhibit skills, et cetera, how people learn skills and learn tools, et cetera, we need to be thoughtful around teaching techniques for each learning modality, okay? So we have folks who are visual learners, and these are folks who need to see the actual thing happening. So they may actually benefit from guided imagery, copying notes, flashcards, et cetera. And different folks learn in that way. We also have auditory learners, which learn through, for example, someone mentioned earlier around motivational interviewing. And one of the things that was helpful for them is hearing motivational interviewing via the audio tapes. That might be someone who is an auditory learner who may learn from lectures or learn from music and other things, other combinations. And then we have the kinesthetic learner, who I like to call a combination of all types of learning, who uses games, problem solving, writing notes, making lists, etc. And that's the way that they're able to pull together how they learn and pull together information that they can learn, etc. So while this is just a basic overview of the different types of learning styles, there are multiple tools out there for you to utilize to work with your supervisees in helping them to suss out and develop what their learning style is, so that as you move forward in your supervision, that you're able to individualize it, connected to not just the modality, et cetera, but also their learning style as well. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Paul, and Paul is going to lead us into module 6. Paul?
That would be me. Yes, I am going to lead us into module 6. And before I do that, I want to say a couple of things. One is I want to normalize something. That using new tools takes time. And that, you know, these different guides are invaluable tools for the clinical supervisor. And it takes time to become comfortable with being able to actually use them and to use them during a supervisory conversation. So we're introducing them to you at this particular point, and we are providing you with minimal, because we have limited time, we're providing you with minimal opportunities to practice with them within the context of our learning community. And what probably will happen after this conversation, and I'm hopeful that this is what will happen, is that you will go back to these tools, because we're going to get to practice with them a little bit more, but you'll go back to these tools and you will actually become acquainted with them. And you will really get a sense of what the value of using these particular tools can be in your supervisory conversations. Now, I want to ask a question, and anyone who wants to, and again, Dr. Blackwell is reminding you to be kind to yourself as you learn to use these assessment tools, and that's a really great reminder. I want to throw out a word, and I'm wondering if somebody would be willing to not think about it too much, but just unmute and give their definition of this word. So I'm going to say the word, and don't think about it too much, just unmute and share your definition of the word. And that word is subjectivity. What is the definition of the word subjectivity, or having something that's subjective? What does that mean? What is subjectivity or subjective? What does that mean?
Based on someone's own feelings, opinions, and experiences.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, and Lisa, what were you going to add? Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's open up to interpretation.
Yeah, open to interpretation. Jacqueline also says subject to change. Ultimately, though, folks, when you think about subjectivity, it's kind of coming from your point of view or your perspective, your subjective take on something. And as a clinical supervisor, you're asked to bring your subjectivity to bear, because you observe a particular behavior or you listen to something, and you're, as the supervisor, asked to subjectively respond to that. Now, what I'll add to that is that the beauty of these particular guides is they help standardize and help you to have an informed subjectivity. So that it's not just because Christy thinks this particular way. Christy has a subjective opinion, and it's an informed and guided subjective opinion. So these guides can be very helpful with creating sort of standards around particular competencies and around skills, knowledge, and attitudes that help remove a little bit of the subjectivity. And as opposed, I think it's kind of impossible to remove subjectivity. I think what it does is it informs and concretizes the subjectivity. So just keeping that in mind, that these tools, and in your role as a clinical supervisor, you are being asked to bring your experience, your values, your belief to the table, and you want to do that in an informed way. Now, the other thing I want to touch on, and I can't remember who it was who asked this, so if you could re-identify yourself, that would be great, because I agree with Dr. Blackwell that this was a fantastic question when you asked, well, what happens if you're using this tool and the supervisor says, well, I rate you at this, and you rate yourself as an expert, but the supervisor hasn't rated you as an expert. And you're like, well, how do you do that? Well, that's two subjective opinions about a particular defined concrete competency. The thing I'd like you to consider in regard to that is an opportunity. And let me give an example. Let's say Christina is my supervisor, and she's looking at a particular competency. And Christina, through her subjective experience and her informed understanding about this competency, she rates me at a 2. But I rate myself at a 4. I'm an expert in my mind. Okay? The beauty of that is that Christina and I can actually have a conversation about that, because her job is not to prove to me that I'm not an expert. Her job is to help to try and understand why I might conceive of myself that way, and to help me to broaden my understanding of what the expectations for that competency actually are. So I'd like you to keep that in mind, because her role is not to say, no, Paul, actually, you're not a 4. Her role is to try and understand it. And I want to give you a parallel process example. And this is a quintessential example in the field of substance use. Is there anyone, and you can use the chat to respond to this, is there anyone in our community that ever has to have conversations with people about toxicology results? And if you have to have conversations with people about toxicology results, type a Y in the chat. And I don't mean your supervisees. I mean, if you're providing direct services. So sometimes a participant or a client will say, well, that's not possible. There's no way I could have tested positive for cocaine. I haven't done cocaine. But you have the toxicology report that says, the report says that you have cocaine. Now you can get into a power struggle there about telling the person, well, this is what the report says. But what I'd like to suggest that you consider, and what counselors consider, is that it's better to have the opportunity to engage in a conversation with that person about their take, trying to understand it from their perspective, and still the discrepancy may exist. But if you're able to have a non-threatening, collaborative conversation about the difference of opinion, that's the benefit. There's one other thing I want to underline in terms of what Dr. Blackwell touched on, and this is touched on several of the slides. You're having a conversation with people about these competencies and helping them to have a broader understanding of these competencies and maybe meet a particular knowledge requirement, skill requirement, or attitude requirement for their professional development. And the whole point of it is, folks, is they can choose to move in the direction of attaining that knowledge, attitude, or skill, or they can choose not to. You can't make a supervisee increase their knowledge. You can assess if they don't have that knowledge and they're not able to carry out their job. So just keeping that in mind, folks, just like with clients, we cannot make clients change, nor can we make supervisees change. We can hopefully engage in a collaborative supervisory alliance with them and engage with them in ways of communication that help that person to want to grow in a direction that makes them more proficient at their jobs. Okay, so before I share my screen, any thoughts or any reactions to what I've just said? Sam's like, no, nothing, no thought, no reaction.
I've been up since 4 a.m. So.
All right, well, thanks for sticking with us, Sam. Any comments, any thoughts, any reactions? Lisa, any thought, any reaction to what I've said?
I think it's really important, you know, again, like that you're meeting everyone where they're at too. And kind of working forward, you know, like if they think they're wonderful at something and you're not quite there yet, you know, or, you know, get their perspective of what, you know, awesome is. Because your definition of awesome is something different from their definition of awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And you want to have mutual understanding. Dion Bird said that it made sense. Okay. All right. You know, I'll tell you, Lisa, when you said, you know, getting a sense of what their awesome means, it reminds me, one of the things that I have the opportunity to do a lot of training, similar, I think, to you, Nico, I get the opportunity to train about motivational interviewing a lot. And folks will come into an MI training and you know, you'll say to them, do you do motivational interviewing? And they'll be like, oh yeah, absolutely. I practice motivational interviewing. Well, if you listen to an audio recording of them, they are not practicing motivational interviewing. They may be asking open-ended questions. They might be doing reflections, but they're not actually practicing motivational interviewing. Now, I'm the trainer, but if I was their supervisor, is there any benefit in me saying to them, well, you know, you're not actually practicing motivational interviewing? What is that going to do to our relationship? But to Lisa's point, I want to find out what leads them to sort of have that understanding of themselves and help them to build capacities to enhance what they're doing. And that's the goal of clinical supervision. So again, anytime during this conversation, you can comment, you can throw something out, just unmute or raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead. See, I knew if I said that, Jasmine would, go ahead, Jasmine, the floor is yours.
I was gonna say, while listening to you, it kind of made me think about like, just like role playing or flipping the script. So how would I want someone to tell me that I can use improvement or that I'm not doing something correctly, right? And so I would think like in every meeting, I would say like, okay, what approach works best for you? Do you like get direct? Do you want me to go around the bush? Do you want me to go up, down, left or right? Like I'm direct. I'd rather you tell me like, I wouldn't do that or that's not the correct way versus like, you know, kind of saying, well, let's try it this way. I was like, don't waste my time. Like just tell me, like, you know, I'm like very like, like that, so.
Yeah, and you know something, Jasmine, you're making such a great point because that's an individual conversation you have with each supervisee. And what you're really talking about, which is a very nice transition, thank you, your check is in the mail, a nice transition into what we're going to be talking about next, is also about how we give feedback. So just keeping that in mind. And I just wanted to note that Dion Bird said, not calling them out, but professionally guiding them. Yes, absolutely. Beautifully, beautifully said. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and let us. All right. So we've discussed these 4 cases. We've gone through module 5. And now we are going to look at performance evaluations. And again, that's what these tools are helpful for. So clearly, performance evaluations hold an important place because they're a way to engage in dialogue. They're also a way to assess, and they are a way to build a collaborative partnership with somebody. If you can think of a performance evaluation that way, hey, it's an opportunity to continue to build our relationship. And the idea that through a performance evaluation, we can give feedback. And again, I love what Jasmine said. As a supervisor, I can think about subjectively how I would like to get feedback, but Sam or Lisa may not want feedback that way. And if they're my supervisees, I want to figure out what's going to be the best way to connect with them, keep a collaborative partnership, and have us be on the same page. And then we're also going to be talking specifically about the structure. Now, it refers to these as supervisory interviews. And it's funny because if I had written these slides, and I didn't, but if I had, I would have called it supervisory conversations, not interviews. Because an interview is sort of like, Jasmine, where were you on January 5th at 7:45 p.m.? That is a little bit of the intent that I get from an interview. And really, this is about a conversation. So just keeping that in mind. If you look at these four sort of roles of performance evaluations, 1 through 4 here, and I'm just very curious as you look at these, if you were going to prioritize them, what order would you put them in? Would you put them in the order that they're in, 1, 2, 3, 4, or would you change the order? And I'm going to ask you to just use the chat as you're looking at these. Which would you prioritize as number 1? So if you thought 3 was number 1, type in the chat like 3, 2, 1, 4, or 3, 4, 2, 1, whichever order you think the priority is. And I'm just going to ask you to look at these and reprioritize them, or leave them in the order they're in if you think that works, but reprioritize them in the chat. Yep, so Lisa thinks that 3 is the most important. So what do you think, folks? Just looking at these, what order would you reprioritize them in? Yep, 4 is the most important. Other people are saying 4. Carol says 3. Joy says 2. Again, notice, folks, I'd like to underline the word subjectivity, because you are all subjectively based on your experience, your beliefs, your understanding, determining which is the highest priority. And that's great, because that's what I asked you to do. Yep, 3, 1, 2, 4, 3, 1, 2, 4. Thank you, Nova. Sam, 4, 3, 1, 2. Euban, 1, 3, 2, 4. And Euban, I bet you like all of them, but you still chose the priority. I'm thinking of you from our last time together about all the models. Excellent. Yeah, so perfect. All right, folks. So keeping that in mind, there is a case study that I'm going to ask everybody to read. And we are going to put you into your small groups, but I'm going to ask everybody to read this. And actually, maybe in your small group, you can read the case study out loud. But I'm going to ask you to read it. And after you read it in your small group, let everybody have a couple of minutes where they can identify any concerns that because you're all putting your supervisor hats on. So you're reading this case study, you all have your supervisor hats on, and you're going to read it out loud in your small group. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, after you've read it out loud in your small group, just individually take a moment and identify any concerns that you might have about the interview. And also note what are any of the positive things that you might offer to the supervisee. What strategies might foster professional development with that particular counselor. And again, I'm not asking you to look at any of the resources or any of the rubrics or the competencies. I'm just asking you from your individual perspective. And on what would you focus in providing performance-based feedback? Okay. So I'm going to ask everybody after the case study is read out loud in your small group, I'm going to ask you all to do that individually. And once you've done that individually, what I'd like you to take just a little bit of time to talk about in your group and come to some sort of agreement is, what are the 2 things that you might focus on in providing performance-based feedback to this counselor? What are a couple of things that you might focus on in providing performance-based feedback to this counselor? So you're going to read the case study out loud. Everybody's going to have a few minutes to answer questions 2, 3, 4, and 5 by themselves. And by the way, this is in your participant workbook on page 50, as it says at the bottom of the slide. And then you are going to talk with each other and as a group come up with 2 things that you would focus on in providing performance-based feedback to this individual. And you please will elect a group reporter to just report out those 2 things. We don't need to hear your answers to 2, 3, and 4. We just need to hear the report out on number 5. Okay? And you will have 15 minutes to do this. So again, you have it in your books, you'll read it out loud, and you're going to report out on question 5. Okay? Any other thoughts or suggestions about how to make this effective for folks? Max, thank you for your feedback. Very helpful. Okay. All right. So Clyde, if you can put people back into their small groups, that would be great. And we will have you'll get a warning at 5 minutes. And please do have a constitutional election to choose a volunteer who will report out. Please no voluntolding. But you certainly can make nominations, but the person has to accept. Okay? And again, that person is going to be ready to point out the 2 things. You'll go to your small group, you'll read it out loud. Someone will read it, volunteer to read it out loud. You can also, if you want, take a little time to read it on your own, whatever works best. 15 minutes total, Clyde, and a warning at 5. So when you get the invitation to go to your small group, just accept that. Whenever you're ready to send people, Clyde, that's great. Thanks so much. Excellent.
Folks should be seeing the invitation to join groups now.
Yep, they are, and they're joining fast and
Perfect.
furious.
Oh, good. It looks like everybody was able to join. Welcome back, everybody.
Fantastic. All right. So we had 5 groups, which means we're going to have 5 reporters. So could all the people who are reporting for their groups just wave or throw money or something? Okay, good. All right, excellent. Yeah, that's perfect, Nico. Thank you. Excellent. Nico threw money. Yay! All right. So since Nico threw money, he can go first. But before, no, I'm kidding. Before Nico starts us off, I'm going to ask all of the reporters to make an executive decision. So all of the reporters are making an executive decision. And this is the executive decision I'm asking the reporters to make. Reporters, your group came up with 2 things to answer question number 5, which would be the performance-based things that you'd bring to the conversation with Megan. I'm going to ask the reporters to pick one of the 2. And I'm going to ask the reporter to tell us why they subjectively picked that one. Very briefly. Okay? Again, I want to underline that what we've asked everybody to do in terms of this activity at this point is to bring the gift of your subjectivity to the table. So again, we're gonna let the reporter pick the one and then say why they picked that one. So Nico, you're reporting for your group. You can tell us your group number and then the one and why you picked that one. I want you as the group reporter. Your group came up with 2. I want you to pick one and say why you chose that one.
One of what exactly?
One of the 2 that your group chose.
Okay.
I don't think we chose 2. Like, I think we talked about everything.
Yeah, we broke everything down and went through the whole thing and then how we would talk to the supervisee about it.
Okay, well, what was one? I'm glad, thank you for telling me it didn't make sense. What was one performance-based issue? Remember, I showed you these questions. And question 5 is what would you focus providing performance-based feedback? So what's one performance-based issue, feedback issue that you would discuss with Megan? And Nico, why are you picking this particular one?
Well, one was that there was no offer of MAT services.
Okay.
And that's one I'm picking personally because I see that as the most salient problem because he's intravenously using opioids, could die later that day. That's just me picking that one.
And that's why I asked you to pick that one. Fantastic. Fantastic. Yeah, go ahead, Danielle. And Danielle, I presume you're representing another group?
Another group.
Okay. Which group are you representing?
We were group 3.
Okay. Are you sure about that?
Yes. At the end, we found out Deanna's on a boat, so I'm also jealous at the moment. But putting that aside, I'm going to go along the same lines. We talked a lot about the lack of safety planning and harm reduction. So I would say harm reduction education, Narcan, fentanyl test strips, resources, none of that. It seemed that the person left with no plan and no education around harm reduction. So that's what I'm
Absolutely. And Danielle, could I ask you a quick follow-up question?
Sure.
Why is that number 1 for you?
Because I think so much of what we do, it should be meeting people where they're at. And I feel like a lot of clinical settings sort of fall short there, which is actually how I'm moving into the role that I'm moving into. So I would say to really meet the person where they're at. We're not trying to push, a ton of goals. We're going to talk about that next time, but how do we keep you safe for the week until we see you again?
Fantastic. Thank you. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Yep.
Go Danielle.
Kimberly, support. Excellent. Very good. Okay, Christina, I believe you were, I
Yes, group 2. So if I was to pick one of everything we discussed many things. I would say safety first. Safety is the main concern here, not just the alcohol and the drug use, but the family expressed concerns on safety with his aggression around the children. So I would say that to assist the counselor in establishing rapport, but including management of a crisis situation, because this was identified as a crisis situation, and determine the need for additional professional assistance in this case. Like previous people said, there was no plan in place whatsoever. So there was a crisis present in the moment, with especially the concern of safety.
Understood. So under the umbrella of safety, Christina has managed for her group to actually mention several performance-based things that she might talk to Megan about. Excellent. And Christina, why would safety be the number 1 for you?
We have this slogan that says safety first, right? If people don't feel safe, how can they work on other goals as well? And as a social worker, I was taught that it's safety, so you have to address safety first and then all the other needs. Person has to be physically, emotionally safe, and those around also, not just the person, but the children, especially as mandated reporters. We have to make sure that the children are safe, and if not, we have to, if we have the suspicion that they're not, we have to contact and report this to higher authorities.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you. Yes, I agree, Yvette. It was a great job. Next reporter, please. There are 2 more reporters that we're waiting to hear from. Yeah, go ahead, Carol.
So we were group 5, I believe. My fellow, they can chime in. But we mostly talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, that base, bottom being safety. And everyone already kind of mentioned that. But for us, it's kind of more like the medical that stand out. Either he's IV using, and he's getting meds. We don't know specifically if he's taking those meds accurately. We don't know if he needs to detox. There's no clarification on that. I also mentioned mandated reporter too, but going over domestic violence, you know, it's 1 in 3 women statistically that's going to happen. So that's another thing we need to kind of report.
Okay.
It was just that lack of, you know, just no treatment planning for this person. That was mainly what we talked about.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Carol. And yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
I was group 1. I think a lot of everybody else kind of touched on what we talked about, but I think one of the biggest things was I feel like the counselor didn't ask what they thought the client thought the biggest problems were. And I think sometimes that's a huge issue, because he got upset when you're saying, okay, you need this, that, and that, and he's like focused on something else. Sometimes you have to kind of address what they're focusing on first before you can kind of bring them to the bigger issues. And seeing what's important, what the client thinks the problem is.
Lisa, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
And you have your supervisor hat on. So if you were going to identify that as a performance issue, how would you conceptualize that?
I think, you know, building off like the positives, which is the rapport.
Yeah.
And as you're building rapport with the client, and then not get really, it seems like she got defeated when the client got upset and she kind of backed off and retreated and give any plans and anything else, and stopped kind of working with the client when the client got upset instead of kind of working through it.
Okay. And that's a slightly different practice issue than what you're suggesting about being client-centered, right?
Yeah.
Because managing like client presenting affect and still kind of keeping the through line is another practice issue.
Yeah, and this is because everything else was already mentioned.
I understand. And you just didn't want to say ditto. We had the same thing, Maya. Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thanks. So folks, keep in mind, again, we asked you specifically with this particular scenario to first look at it subjectively, because ultimately that's what any clinical supervisor is doing in the beginning. And what we'd like you to consider is that being a clinical supervisor, we start there and then we move into other areas and we access other resources. So having said that, I'm going to share my screen again. And I'd like you to consider, folks, that we have these performance assessment rubrics. We have that document that was shared with us. And there are also fidelity measures for evidence-based practices. There are tools that can be used and perspectives that can be adopted in order to make sure that we're maintaining fidelity with a particular evidence-based practice. And I'll give you a concrete example, because we had an earlier counselor who wanted to learn about motivational interviewing. There's an evidence-based measure called the MIGHTY 2.4.1 that is an evidence-based measure for the practice of motivational interviewing. If you were supervising somebody and your goal was to help them to achieve fidelity, you would want to use an evidence-based measure for that evidence-based practice. But again, you would need to know how to use that. So let's go back to the assessment rubrics, okay? Because you could reconsider this case study with Tony and Megan, and we could look at two particular practice dimensions, 1 and 2, in the rubrics. So what I'm going to ask people to do is go to page 53 in your workbooks, and I'm going to stop sharing this for a minute, but I'd like you to go to page 53 in your workbooks, and somebody tell me what you see on page 53 in your workbooks.
It says methods for monitoring performance.
Okay, thank you. And actually, does it not say performance evaluation, integrative activity? Is anybody seeing, if you're seeing that, type a Y in the chat.
It might be that because sometimes the PDF changes the pages.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you might be looking at page 52, which says methods, which is direct observation, what we talked about before. So maybe looking at page 53.
Okay.
Or 54. And then it says using rubrics document, read through the rubrics dimensions 1, screening and assessment, and 2, dimension 2, treatment planning. And it tells you in the rubrics where they are. Now, I'm going to give everybody the address. What I'd like everybody to do is go to your rubrics document to page 42. And I'm going to go there right now with you. It's in your rubric. And if you are there, tell me what it says. Somebody unmute and tell me what it says at the top.
Treatment planning.
Excellent. And what is the next sentence under that?
Competent professional is able to
Excellent.
37 to 48.
Yep, perfect. Now, if you look there, you'll see the highlighted part with like the arrow kind of thing pointing to it, 40, 41, and 42. I'd like a volunteer, if they would be willing, to read out 40, 41, and 42. And I'm going to ask you to be thinking of Megan as you hear this. So is someone willing to read out 40, 41, and 42?
I'll do it. Examine treatment options in collaboration with the client and significant others. 41
Okay.
is consider the readiness of the client and significant others to participate in treatment.
Okay.
And prioritize the client's needs in the order they will be addressed in treatment.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, what I'm going to ask everybody to do is, as you look at that, those are the 3 things we're focusing on with Megan. If you were going to pick one of those, just one at this particular moment, because we're learning how to use this tool. If you were going to pick one of those that was most relevant to your take and your understanding of the conversation with Megan, which one of them would you pick? And type the number in the chat, 40, 41, or 42. So which one would you pick? And I'm asking you to type that in the chat. Okay, which one would you pick? If you were going to be engaging in a supervisory conversation with Megan, which one would you pick? And just type it right into the chat. Okay, so I think people are still thinking, because I'm not hearing anybody type anything in the chat. I'm not seeing anybody type anything in the chat, nor am I hearing anybody type anything in the chat. But which one of those would you focus on with Megan? And just type the number in the chat. Yep.
So Paul, I'm seeing some competencies popping up here. So excuse me for bending my head down.
No problem.
Let's see, it says 42.
41, 42.
I'm seeing quite a bit 42s, 41.
Quite a bit of 42s, okay.
Yeah, it seems like 40, 41 and 42. Well, it's 42 is the most popular, and then 41 is a few 41s.
All right. If we had more time, we'd let the 42s and the 41s debate, but we don't have time for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick 42. So I want everybody to go back to their rubric. Okay. Go back to your rubric and go down to page 43. Now you'll see that number 42, prioritize the client's needs in the order they will be addressed in treatment. Awareness, initial application, competent practice, or mastery. I am going to ask you to evaluate using the scale that we have available, that 1 through 4. And remember, Dr. Blackwell laid out for us earlier, this is a competency. It's sort of a degree. Awareness is the lower end and mastery is the highest end. So if you were going to rate using 42, prioritize the client's needs in order that they will be addressed in treatment, where does Megan fall? Is she a 1, 2, 3, or 4? Based on your understanding of the scenario. And I'm going to ask you to put the number in the chat. Yeah. So far I'm seeing 1s. That people are rating her a 1. So folks, that is an area where you could engage in a supervisory conversation around developing that particular capacity. But notice, you've gone from subjective to identifying the competency and then to actually using a specific tool to rate the competency. So you've taken your subjectivity and you've informed it using this tool. Okay? So just keeping that in mind, that's the purpose of these particular tools, to make sure that your subjectivity becomes informed. And so you have guidance about how to talk about it. Okay? So that's just, again, moving into the application or the practical use of the rubric as a tool to inform your supervisory conversations. Now, we haven't even had the conversation yet, but we are preparing for the conversation. This is the preparatory work for the conversation. So keeping that in mind. Now, I am going to share my screen again, and we are going to move a little bit forward. So again, keeping in mind that these tools are to support your ability to engage in supervisory conversations that are based on specifics and not just driven by subjectivity. I'd like you to pay attention to this picture that's on the right here as well. We're going to come back to this later, but I'd like you to pay attention to that picture. Now, the basic concept behind any kind of feedback conversation is, again, the supervisor interpretations of the behavior, like it says here, are fueled by our own assumptions back to our subjectivity. We want to give clear statements and acknowledge the reality of our assumptions, because they are simply our assumptions. Again, we've done the preparatory work, they're informed, but they're still our assumptions. We want to share our thoughts during the conversation and also be clear about what the expectations are. And the feedback we give, we want to be very thoughtful about how we develop that feedback, because we want to maintain a collaborative partnership. we want to be specific, and we want to make sure that it's feedback that the person is actually going to be able to use. And part of the benefit of sort of performance feedback is you take the time to make sure that there's mutual understanding between you and the supervisee, that you're both basically on the same page about what's going on. And again, if there are discrepancies, you talk through that so you come to some sort of agreement about what the page is. So keeping that in mind, the one thing I think to keep in mind is that feedback, when you give feedback, either verbal or nonverbal feedback, it's got to be specific. And again, it's subjective information about a person's behavior in a particular situation. I would also say too, I'm going to ask people to think and use the chat. When you hear the word feedback, what's the first word that pops into your head? And type it in the chat. So you hear the word feedback. Oh, I'm going to give you some feedback. What's the first word that pops into your head? And there's mistake, criticism, okay, perspective, advice, criticism, negative. Yes. Yep. Opportunity, criticism, point of view, impact. Okay. And again, I just want to acknowledge something that Danielle added in the chat. I would also add the expectation of how I would hope they would respond or invite them to provide alternatives. Yes. Thanks for adding that, Danielle. Criticism and another perspective, outside perspective, criticism. Okay, so I don't know about you, but as I look at what people are writing in the chat, I would say, and I think this is a fair guesstimation, emphasis on guesstimation, I think it's a fair guesstimation that it's probably 50% or more people are associating the word with feedback with something either apprehensive or negative. And again, that was a guesstimation. But clinical supervision is about changing that balance. So again, I love this slide because it reinforces the autonomy of the supervisee, but part of the objective is to share, to transmit, to be able to have something go from Dr. Blackwell to me, or from Christina to her supervisee, to transmit reliable information so that a person can establish a data bank so that they can consider changing a behavior or developing capacity if they, and that should probably be not she, he, it should probably be they, because we want to be inclusive, if they choose to do so. Okay, so we are offering this feedback for the person to consider it and see if it will impact how they go forward. Because again, we can't make the person. So there is a basic model that we'd like to suggest that people consider around feedback, and it's called the oral feedback model. I didn't name this, but I do like this model because it speaks to, again, what we observe. We share what we observe to the person. We acknowledge that we're operating on our informed assumption. And then we level with the person and have a clear conversation about expectations or possible next steps. Again, when I saw or heard you, I assumed that, that's the assumption, and my reaction was. Okay, this is a model of giving feedback. There are some other elements that we can add to this model, which are starting by asking permission. We can request a playback of the message with the person, and then we can confirm mutual understanding after an accurate playback. Okay? So what I am going to attempt to do is briefly demonstrate this particular model. And I need a volunteer, dare I say, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Dare I say, I need a volunteer who would be willing to engage in a role play. I will play the supervisee and you, no, I will play the supervisor and you will play the supervisee. So is somebody willing to be the supervisee? And I'm going to be giving you specific feedback, demonstrating the oral model, hopefully. Now, I can guess as to who may not be volunteering for this, but I'm wondering if there's somebody who would be willing to volunteer.
Sure, Paul, I will.
Fantastic, Yvette. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So let me set the stage very quickly and succinctly. I have the opportunity to be a supervisor of Yvette. She did an audio recording of a conversation she was having with a client using the evidence-based practice of motivational interviewing. And she allowed, as part of our supervision, remember, direct observation. I'm using an audio recording, which is a direct observation of Yvette's practice. And now I'm going to be talking to her briefly about that particular audio recording. Okay? So that's the scenario, Yvette. I've listened to an audio recording of you practicing motivational interviewing with a client, and then we're meeting to talk about that experience. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. So as we do that, now I'm going to pause during this and I'm going to ask, and I want you to look at your handouts about this, because you'll see that in your participant manual on, I believe it's page 55, your participant workbook, you will have these 8 different things. And I want you to be watching for if I'm doing them. Okay? And then we'll have a brief discussion about this afterward. So Yvette, are you ready?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, Yvette, I want to thank you for having the time available today to meet for supervision. And I had the opportunity to listen to your audio recording, and I was wondering if it would be okay if we spent a little bit of time in our supervision today talking about that.
Yes. How'd I do?
Well, it's a great question, and I guess I want to invite you to answer that question first. What was your thought about it? How did you think you did in terms of practicing motivational interviewing with this particular client?
Well, because he had some behavioral issues, I was a little intimidated at first. You know, sometimes from the level of his voice, he had a high pitch, then a low pitch.
Yeah.
I try to use some reflective statements with him, but at times, you know, I felt intimidated because his body language and his pitch in his voice kind of reflected something different. So I should have asked him more questions or asked him why he felt like that, but I didn't.
Okay.
And I kind of let him take over the conversation.
Okay. All right. So again, it was a little hard to get a sense of where he was at because of kind of the change in his tone of voice. And you were kind of feeling like you sort of let him kind of take over the conversation. And you did attempt to do some reflective statements.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, if it's okay with you, can I offer you some feedback about some strengths that you brought to the conversation?
Absolutely.
Well, I want to start by saying that clearly you established and maintained rapport with him throughout the conversation because he continued to talk. and you did ask questions, and he gave you some pretty detailed answers. So again, I want to underline that you were very effective in establishing and maintaining the rapport and the use of your questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Any other thoughts or reactions to the strengths that you brought to it?
I thank you, because I didn't feel like I did that well in the session today, but I'm glad that you saw that there were some good things about it.
Okay.
I think that I want to feel comfortable in the sessions, especially with somebody of the opposite sex. And the reason why I say that is because, at times, I guess he uses his hands as gestures, and it made me uncomfortable a little bit. So I think that's where, got misconstrued, but I think I need more training with motivational interviewing.
Okay. Well, that's certainly something we can talk about. And, you're raising a really important question about how you can continue to feel safe in the conversation, and knowing that this client uses gestures is something that, we'll both want to be paying attention to make sure that you feel comfortable in the conversation as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So given the strengths that you brought to the conversation, I did notice something that I saw as possibly a growth opportunity for you in terms of your use of motivational interviewing. And I'm wondering if it would be okay if I told you a little bit about that, and if we could talk a bit about that.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. So you mentioned your use of questions, and I noticed, and you also mentioned your use of reflections. I noticed, because I used a validated instrument during the conversation, and I noticed that as the conversation went on, you began to rely more and more on questions and kind of moved away from reflections. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your thoughts about that, because I was assuming that maybe you felt pressure that you needed to collect more information, and you thought that questions maybe were the best way to do that. So what's your thought, or what's your reaction to that?
I think that I was trying to clarify some of the feelings and some of the answers that he responded with the question. So that was some of the reflection. So I kept referring back to some of the questions, and I think that agitated him a lot. So I think that's where the agitation started at, because I kept going back to the questions that I had asked previously, but in a reflective style. So I was trying to get clarity and gather information as well, so that I can assist them in the best way from what I had learned, And so I think that was the problem,
Okay. Yeah. So you're realizing that in some way, although you were trying to collect more information, the questions were actually kind of causing the client to become more agitated. And the more agitated he got, you kind of would offer more questions in order to try and get a more of a handle on what was going on.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So maybe one of the things that we can focus on as we go forward is how you can kind of trust your hunches and maybe use reflections as a way to reflect back to the client what your gut and kind of heart are telling you he might be feeling, and see if maybe that decreases his agitation. I'm wondering what your thought is about that as a suggestion.
I think that that's good, because when I saw the level of irritation, and instead of asking him, hey, is everything okay? Is there something that we need to sort out before we move forward? I didn't do that. I just continue with the reflections. And I think that I kind of took him out of the equation and more about what I needed to get done. So,
Okay. So based on what we've talked about, tell me sort of your take on what you think you'll do next when you meet with this client, and how it might be helpful to proceed.
I think that I would start off by being honest and saying, hey, last time, I asked a lot of questions and, I kind of want to know how you feel about things that can be improved in us building this rapport, moving forward. And if something is frustrating you or, going away, please speak up and say that, so that we can build that rapport.
Okay. So you're going to be really transparent that
Yes.
you were relying on questions, and maybe, the actual practice of reflections is something that you and I can maybe take some time in our next supervision to maybe role play how you can offer reflections instead of questions. Is that something you'd be open to?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, again, Yvette, I really want to thank you for your engaging in this conversation today. And again, one of the things we'll do when we meet next, and you'll give me, your update on this conversation, is you're going to employ transparency. And we're going to take some time, you and I, to even practice you offering reflections instead of kind of asking question after question.
Yes.
All right. Well, again, I want to thank you for the conversation today, and I'll look forward to our next meeting.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. Excellent. Thanks so much. End of role play. All right. So folks, I just want to check in and ask, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. Did I hit the 8 points, basically? If you think I basically got the 8 points, type a Y in the chat. If there's something that you think I missed, by all means, if you think there's a particular number I missed, say what you thought I missed. And don't worry, you're going to get credit no matter what you say, as long as you stay to the end of the training and finish your final assignment. Okay, so most people think I did the 8 points. Now I'm going to ask you, because we need to move forward into kind of locating this oral model into a larger structure, I'm going to ask you, and Keith, maybe I could ask you to respond to this. If there's one thing that stood out to you about what the supervisor did during the conversation with Yvette, what's one thing that stood out to you that the supervisor did? And I'm going to invite everybody to think about that. But I'm going to ask Keith if he's willing to unmute. And yeah, go ahead, Keith.
Good morning.
Morning.
First, it was fun. I kind of laughed in the beginning when you asked, because how could I say this? I guess the way programs are moving now than how they were back, it's totally different from counselor to client, supervisor to supervisee. So when you first got into the supervision and you asked, can I ask you, how do you feel about certain things? I wanted to ask you this, Dr. Blackwell and Paul, with everything being sensitive and understanding everything when it comes to programs, how much did the input of the supervisee in terms of the quote unquote session with the client impact how you would respond, right? For example, so the lady that was being a supervisee said,
yeah,
I feel, yes, Yvette, okay. A, B, and C, right? I think this is, if she would have said, oh, how about this? If she would have said, you know what, during a session, I felt uncomfortable or something negative, would you have still approached her the exact same way? That's how, because I feel like that's how the field is going, where it's like, you have to be nice. Am I using right? You have to be nice about everything that you say when it reflects something that you might not genuinely feel, or just like the wording. I guess the wording. That's what the wording on everything.
Understood. And Keith, let me make a distinction, and then I'll let Dr. Blackwell jump in. I didn't say anything to Yvette that I didn't mean.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say something to a supervisee that I didn't mean.
Okay.
Yeah, and I wasn't.
I'm sorry.
No, it's a great question. And again, I think the thing that stood out to you, and tell me if I'm right in hearing this, the thing that stood out to you was the fact that I invited the supervisee to tell me her thought or her reaction or how she felt.
Not saying it's not valid. I'm just saying like,
yeah. And again, the reason I did that is because that's part of the model, but I also did it because I'm trying to build the supervisory alliance. I'm trying to build collaboration. Yeah. Dr. Blackwell, do you want to comment on that before Yvonne says anything?
I mean, that's exactly where I was going, in that in maintaining or creating or maintaining the supervisory alliance, it's about a collaboration. And that collaboration includes bi-directional communication.
Right.
So if I don't hear from my supervisee, then there is no collaboration. And I think it speaks to potentially, and I might be wrong about this, some of the response when Paul asked earlier, when he mentioned, what do people think about when they think about feedback? And so folks feeling potentially that this feedback is going to be a negative thing, where Paul is creating and this model is creating, and something that you will definitely want to think about, how do you bring it into your practice, is about creating a space where folks feel like feedback is not negative, it's constructive. It's something that I can learn from. This is a learning opportunity, which is one of Paul's favorite words, opportunity. And so, and I also recognize, and I want to touch base into, I understand exactly where you're coming from, because I'm from that environment, ran a clinic, did all of those things. And I understand that do we have time to do this, do the language and all of that? And I think it's, yes, we do. I think if you're authentic and genuine, as Paul was, it's going to come out naturally. We're talking about the parallel process, the same thing you would do with a client, asking them, sussing out the information, asking them how they felt, meeting them where they are, is the same thing you would do with a supervisee. I don't know where a supervisee is if I don't ask. Yeah. And open to that feedback.
Yeah. And I will underline, and then we'll go to Yvonne, but I would also underline too, I did give Yvonne the feedback that I wanted to give her. And we did make an agreement about what we were going to focus on in terms of the capacity that she was going to develop. But it was in the context of a collaborative, supportive, supervisory conversation. Yeah, Keith, did you want to comment on that? And then
I
we'll
just
go
wanted to say one thing.
Right
I guess it reminds me, because I don't call it new age, because when I was a substance abuse counselor, I worked with a lot of people that was traditional and old, how treatment was, and encounter groups and stuff like that, all that stuff, residential, right? It just reminded me, because I know like now a lot of programs is moving towards person-centered, right? Or it's person-centered. And I don't, and it's funny to me, because it's person-centered. If I come into treatment and I need help, right? And my counselor is stating, you know, or moving in the theory, in certain theories or ways of person-centered, but I don't know where I need help. Is it actually person-centered, or is it the great counselor who makes it feel like person-centered with all their input and skills that allow me to push me along the way of where I need to go? That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I get it. And I think what you're talking about is the difference between a director and a guide. And in clinical supervision, and in good service provision, we're a guide. And it remains client-centered, but we're a guide, because ultimately that person decides what they're going to do or not do. Yvonne, what were you going to say? What comment did you want to make?
So first, I want to say thank you for this. I never, like, when I go into supervision with my supervisors, it's mainly, you know, they don't ask for the permission. So my question is, if I have a supervisee and I say, you know, do you mind, you know, and I ask the supervisee, you know, can I have your permission to, and they say no, like, you know, where do you go with that?
I love that question. And I love that. Go ahead. Did somebody want to say something?
No, that was me. That's the reason why. That's the reason why I asked about when I said it's funny when you ask, like, what would it be? What if they just say, you know what? No. Do you just not be able to?
Great. So Keith, so let's play that out for just a quick minute, okay? So Yvonne, Keith and I are going to play this out for you. So Keith, you know, I had the opportunity to listen to your audio recording, and I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to talk to you about it. And I have some feedback about some of the strengths you brought to it and some growth opportunities. And I'm wondering if it would be okay if I shared some of my feedback with you at this particular point.
Thank you for asking, Paul, as my supervisor. However, currently I'm not comfortable with you giving me feedback because I don't want to feel like I'm being discouraged as a counselor or feel like my emotions might affect how I counsel my next client at 3 p.m.
Okay, so you're really concerned and sort of focused on the next client you're going to see, and you're also worried that, you know, maybe somehow my feedback would keep you from kind of moving in the direction that you're growing into as a counselor.
Yes, definitely. You're spot on with that.
Yeah. So Keith, what are your thoughts about how we should proceed? What would you like to focus on today?
Got me stumped. I'm just saying in general, as in the session. Okay, there you go. That's the skills right there. There you go.
Well, and let's underline that, because if somebody says no, folks, and given that people know that that supervision is about having a conversation, and hopefully it's not about criticism, it's about a collaborative conversation. But if Keith trusts me enough as his supervisor to take the risk to say no, now is not really a good time for me, I want to pay attention to that. Because A, I want to respect Keith's boundaries in this particular moment. I want to respect that something could be going on with him at this particular moment. So if down the road, 6 months down the road, every time I ask permission to offer feedback, he says no, that may be a different issue. But that's not where we are at this particular moment. Okay. So keeping that in mind, folks, there's a lot more we could say about this particular little demonstration. And again, Yvette, thank you so much for being open to doing that, for jumping in and volunteering. Greatly appreciated. And I just want to share my screen to leave you with a model that I'd like you to consider that you can embed this oral process into, okay? And again, it says, it refers to this here as supervisory. We're going to skip that, skipping that. It calls this a supervisory interview, but really, please think of it as a supervisory conversation. And the first step is, of course, setting the agenda. Now, Yvette and I did not demonstrate that part. We went right to the oral model. But keep in mind, we want to set up an agenda. And again, we want to invite the supervisee to bring their agenda. And the objectives of that is providing some sort of structure, because if you have an agenda, at least you know what you're going to be talking about. It's a great way to decrease anxiety because hopefully the supervisee is part of structuring the agenda, and it helps build trust. And then the giving of the feedback is critical. And again, the oral model guides us with that. But again, it's an opportunity to empower the person and to individualize their supervision. And then teach and negotiation. If we had a longer time and Yvette and I could have carried on the role play, we could have done some skills practice, some role play on how to help build the capacity of doing reflections instead of relying on questions. And then securing commitment, we did a little bit of that in the demonstration, but we could have shown more of that where we would be agreed on what the actual next steps were going forward in terms of, I'm going to try doing more reflections. I'm going to report that back to you. those kind of things. But this particular structure is a great way to build the supportive framework of the supervisory. Again, they call it an interview, but I'm rewriting it in this particular moment because I'm talking and I'm calling it a supervisory conversation. Okay. So having said that, folks, I think, Dr. Blackwell, if you don't have any objections, I think now would be a good time to take the 15-minute break.
Yes.
All right. So folks, we're going to take a 15-minute break and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Okay. Please go ahead and activate your cameras. Welcome back. Our break is now excellent. Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you.
Danielle is back. Fantastic. Dion's back. Great. Good. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, Max. Excellent. I think we're ready to go, Dr. Blackwell.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are heading into, as Paul indicated, the down stretch or the last stretch of our training, and we're moving into Module 7. And one of the things I want to remind you of is that Module 7 is considered, or Module 7 is counselor development. And we've been doing a lot of work leading up to that. Okay. And one of the things that I want to set the stage for is Paul did an amazing job in setting the stage of supervision and the supervision session, supervision discussion, etc., because counselor development happens in the supervision conversation. So now that you have that framework, all of the things that we talk about is focused or is happening in that supervision discussion. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. So we are now moving into counselor development, and some of the things that all of the things that we've covered thus far are definition and roles in Module 1. Module 2 was focused on developing your own personal theory around clinical supervision. Module 3 was focused on the development and maintaining of the supervisory alliance. Module 4 was focused on modalities and methods in which to conduct supervision or a part of the supervision process. And 5, we touched on assessment resources that you can utilize in your ongoing clinical supervision. And we touched on the fact that while you may have not seen these before, that these are resources that over time you will feel more acclimated to as you use them. Each person will develop their own strategy and how they use them, but there are tools to keep the supervision subjective in a way that everyone is on the same page as to what is being looked at. Okay, so when we talk about the competencies, you and the supervisee are looking at the same competencies, the K, the S, and the A's, and there is no confusion around where this potentially came from. I want to remind folks that with any assessment resource or with any resource that you're utilizing with supervisees, it is always best to introduce them prior to bringing them full into the supervision. So you may want to do that in a group supervision, make sure everyone has the materials, and or you may want to pilot it if, with one person to see how that process works, okay? And then last module, we talked about performance evaluations, and we really leaned into how do you give feedback to folk in the supervisory discussion. And now we're going to move into the PDP. I want to remind folks that the professional development plan or the counselor development or the professional development plan that you will be going over is also going to be the same assignment that you will have to return back to us at ATTC so that we can grant you your certificate. So I just wanted to remind you of that, okay? So Module 7, verbalize a process for facilitating professional growth of supervisees, which we actually pretty much have done because that amazing role play in regards to providing feedback and the discussion of the supervisory discussion. Paul is going to talk a little bit about appreciating cultural and contextual factors that impact the supervisory relationship. While in Module 3, we focused on the supervisory alliance, there is a bit more that we need to flesh out to talk about things that can impact the supervisory alliance. And then we're going to do a short truncated exercise around utilizing a professional development plan, and I'll go over that and we will move it forward, okay? So when we talk about steps in the growth process, we want to kind of lean into what we've covered thus far. One, understanding a common or having a common understanding of supervision between yourself and the supervisee, considering the uniqueness of each supervisee, and this is when we talk about the individualized focus of each supervisee, what they bring to the table, who they are, learning styles, etc. Okay, then we're going to firsthand observation of job performance, which we understand is the gold standard of performance evaluation. Actually seeing, actually hearing someone commit to a counseling process or engaged in group work is a gold standard in regards to performance evaluation. Assessing strengths and priorities for improvement. Again, assessment with utilizing the assessment tools that you have been given or the assessment resources, and figuring out what is the best way that you're going to be able to bring that into the supervisory discussion to provide feedback and coaching to enhance awareness. And then we move into negotiating a plan. So after you've had consistent supervision, after you've identified challenges, strengths, priorities, etc., and you're having that ongoing, because remember, this is about ongoing clinical supervision. This is not a one-off thing, okay? That's consistent ongoing supervision. You then will come at different times throughout the supervision journey to have an opportunity to negotiate a plan to guide the process, to guide the learning, to guide the growth. And then we'll work on establishing measures to assess progress, which we already have kind of in place when we talk about the competencies and the rubrics. So Paul, can you move us into the discussion around contextual factors that impact the Alliance?
Sure. The part about the cultural piece.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. If you would stop sharing your screen, I'll share mine.
I will stop sharing my screen.
Great.
There you go.
Excellent. So folks, I think it's important to acknowledge, and I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we could spend as much time talking about these cultural components that impact the supervisory conversation as we've spent over the 3 days that we've been together.
Mm-hmm.
So that has kind of been condensed into a 4-slide kind of mention of these particular factors. But I want to acknowledge that there's much more complexity to this and much more sort of deep reflection and thought that each of us in our role as supervisors need to do around these particular elements that we bring to the supervisory conversation. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to ask everybody to use the chat. Now, I've doctored this slide a little bit. This is not how this slide normally appears, but I'm going to ask folks to acknowledge for me using the chat, how many people do you see in this photograph? And just type the number of people in the photograph in the chat. And don't think about it too much, just, it's not a trick photo either. It's pretty straightforward. Okay. Yeah, so how many people are in that photograph? Yes. Now, there are 2 people in this photograph. One of them is wearing a pinkish red blouse and another one is wearing a white blouse or shirt, whichever word you use. But the thing I'm going to ask you is, in this photograph, which one of these individuals, which one of these people is the supervisor? And just type it into the chat, either the pink or the white shirt. So which one is the supervisor? What do you think? So far, everybody is saying pink shirt. Euban says the white shirt, the white top. Tom says the pink. Okay. Now, the thing I'd like everybody to consider is, first of all, I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know which one of these 2 individuals is the supervisor, but I can tell you something. I had an assumption of which one was the supervisor based on a variety of things. And what I'd like us all to consider is that we don't know who was the supervisor in that picture. But because of who we are, because of the unique identities and experiences that we all bring to this conversation, it's critical for us to develop awareness about our own assumptions or our own takes. And I just thought that that photograph was a very interesting way. And I think Shareya said earlier, I think on maybe day 2 in our training, that some of the imagery or some of the framing in this training, because this is an older training, is very heteronormative and cisgender oriented. The languaging of she and he, as opposed to they, which is more inclusive in terms of people's gender identities. So being a clinical supervisor means that we have to become and continue to work on our self-awareness, that we want to do our best to engage in supervisee. And Keith, I'm thinking of you as I say this, when you were talking about these new models that we're kind of bringing to it, but we do want to be engaging in supervisee-centered relationships and conversations. And we also want to be culturally responsive, meaning that we're acknowledging the fact that there are cultural differences between ourselves and our supervisees. And as supervisors, we must consider how someone's culture frames their experience and their thinking. And if we try to pretend that that doesn't exist, we're not doing our supervisee justice, because they bring who they are to the supervisory conversation, just like we do. Keith, you have a thought or a reaction about that. Go ahead. Go ahead. Please unmute.
So I understand when you say the cultural aspects and we have to. Now let me ask this question.
Please do.
I need to take it new knowledge. You stated that like we must acknowledge the cultural differences within, right? I was a big component on, I guess this is personal, right? Growing up as culture is built within your house, right? So because we have the same pigmentation or doesn't mean that we are culturally the same, right? So
right.
When you speak to understand it, what if you don't believe as a super, what if you've educated on multicultural issues and stuff like that, but you don't believe that the difference in culture is necessarily that impacts your supervision or the client and counselor collaboration, like and like for example, as a substance abuse counselor, I don't believe, because for example my significant others Dominican heritage and they drink, you know, that's a part of their culture, right?
Yep.
What if I didn't believe that say my client is a Dominican person, right? So of Dominican heritage, and they stated that, you know, I started out, you know, it's culture, but then it became a substance use disorder for me, right? Yep. And I didn't believe, because your culture is different, that I have to deal with you different when it comes to you wanting to be abstinent from alcohol or something, like, you know what I mean? Like, because we have different cultures doesn't blur the line of the goal, I guess, if I'm making any sense.
You are making complete sense. And the only point here in terms of cultural responsivity from the supervisor's perspective is we need to be open to and understand that the supervisee's cultural experience, identities, heritage can have an impact during the conversation with the supervisor. And that's not a bad thing. It's just something, or a good thing. It's just what is. And as supervisors, we need to be open to the fact that because we are individuals, we can only see things through our own lenses, and we have to be open to try and see it through somebody else's lens. Just like if you were a counselor providing services to somebody. So again, all these things, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, religion, recovery status, all these things potentially could become active ingredients or elements for having a deeper understanding about, because of who we're interacting with and how they may play out within the context of the supervisory conversation. And again, we could spend 3 days just on these cultural issues and talking about these things, and they're, positioned in the way that they're positioned within this particular training, because the emphasis in this particular training was really about the mechanics of clinical supervision. And now we're talking about some of the nuances of it. So again, this idea that we can build relationships with our supervisees by examining our own biases and assumptions, being able to explore and discuss differences openly. Again, being open to increasing our own personal sensitivity. It's not on here, but I often talk about cultural humility, where we adopt the perspective that, we can only see through our own lenses, and our supervisee can be the guide to their cultural experience. Because we can't, even if we're of the same racial or cultural background, we're not having the same experience. Again, noting that we may value different things. We can purposefully promote contextual understanding. So helping people, the supervisee can help us to understand why something may be very important to them that we, based on our lenses, might not see as important. Again, we can build strengths in that relationship. We can work to collaborate. I love the fact that Dr. Blackwell has reminded us a couple of times about the bi-directional nature of clinical supervision, because the supervisee is learning and growing, but because we have the opportunity to collaborate with the supervisee, we are learning and growing simultaneously, perhaps in different ways, but we also have that opportunity. And again, we may find that there are trainings that could help the entire staff to raise awareness about particular cultural opportunities and different cultures that exist within our staff community. And again, we can work toward creating an environment that respects and welcomes multicultural communication, that we want you to bring who you are to this conversation, and we do want to understand who you are as we engage in this collaborative relationship. And you can keep in mind these 4 simple things. Those were strategies, and these are 4 simple steps. We can avoid generalizing. Oh, well, I have a supervisee who identifies as Latinx, therefore the next supervisee that I have who identifies as Latinx is probably shares a lot of similarities to them. Well, no 2 people are the same, so we can avoid generalizations. We can also, especially if we reflect on ourselves, we can be aware of the fact that there are a lot of things that impact how we think, perceive, and how we do something. And as a clinical supervisor, you want to try and understand from your supervisee's perspective. And if you're not sure about something, ask in a respectful way, because you want to have a better sense of knowing. Don't make an assumption that you know. And again, don't imagine that you know all there is to know. And Keith, I'm thinking of what you were saying about, like, somebody going to a training on cultural competence. They may leave that training and think, well, now I know. Well, I think if you're attending a cultural competency training, hopefully the thing you leave with is that you may know something about yourself, but you know even less about other people. And that is not a bad thing. That is not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's an extraordinary opportunity where you can continue to grow as well. So having said that, I'm going to pass things back over to Dr. Blackwell and to invite Dr. Blackwell to make any comments or any additions to that cultural piece that you may want to make as well, Dr. Blackwell.
Nope, I think you did an excellent job in covering that. And also reminding folks that taking a cultural competency training does not mean you are suddenly miraculously culturally competent, that it is an ongoing journey. So we've been talking about, and we've been building up to the opportunity for counselor development, right? And so we've talked about all of the moving pieces. We also know that counselor development happens in the context of the supervisory discussion. And so now I'm going to give you another tool or share another tool with you that you can utilize in regards to how do you pull the counselor's development together. And it's called the Professional Development Plan. It's located on page 66 in your participant workbook. There's one copy there, but you also received an additional copy for you to utilize in your ongoing work as a supervisor. So we're going to spend a few minutes leaning into the framework of the PDP, and then you're going to get a concise opportunity to practice a PDP with Megan, okay? In the chat, before I share my slides, in the chat, I have placed the competencies for Megan. And so you're going to be practicing that in your breakout groups for a few minutes. You will not need to report back, okay? But this is just a practice. You will receive further practice in really pulling together your PDP for your homework assignment, because that is in fact your homework assignment, okay? So let me move us forward. Let me see. I'm seeing some stuff in the chat. I want to make sure I'm covering that.
Yep. It was just a question about what page, and Danielle jumped in and said it was page 66.
Awesome, thank you. And again, if you use the one in your participant workbook, you have another copy of it that's yours, okay? So let me share my screen. So when we talk about the PDP, we're talking about another resource for you to utilize. And so what are the elements of this planning tool? What are the elements of the PDP? We have a target competency, counselor strengths, specific concerns, identification of the target KSAs, which are the knowledge, skills, and the attitudes, the learning activities, and the measures of progress. Now, when we think about that and we connect it to the parallel process, it sounds very much like a treatment plan or a service plan. And so it is very much connected to that same process, but we're utilizing it with supervisees, okay? So this is what the PDP looks like. And so the PDP, the professional development plan, of course, has your identifying information, staff name, etc. But we also want to put in the foundation or practice dimension. So this comes from the rubrics. Okay, this comes from the rubrics. And so, for example, an element might be screening, which you'll be doing with Megan, right? So we have the practice dimension, which comes under application of practice, and then we have the element, which is screening. We also have to identify the competency in which we are going to be addressing, okay? So that competency, it comes from tab 21, that's your addiction competencies, but you don't have to put the page number, okay? You don't have to put the page number unless you feel like that's a helpful process, okay? The next piece is we want to look at the strengths. Now, when we talk about strengths-based practice, right, regardless as to what the challenges may be for any supervisee, there are also strengths that definitely need to be acknowledged, right? And so as you're processing this in the supervisory discussion, and if we hearken back to the discussion that Paul had, what I think was Yvette, he talked about some key things that went well, some thoughts, and some things that, you know, definitely would need to be worked on, right? So talked about strengths, which we identify, and we also talk about challenges and concerns. So when you use the oral feedback model, right, when you're giving feedback, you're asking permission, you're talking about your shared concerns, you're identifying strengths, but you're also identifying possible learning opportunities as well. And those are the challenges and concerns, okay? Now, when we talk about the present level of proficiency, this can either come from the supervisor, or that collaborative conversation that is had in the supervision discussion, okay? And so that is the present level of proficiency. And then we move to the level that we would like for the counselor or the supervisee to get to, right? So let's say they're at 1, which is awareness. We'd like for them to get to maybe 2 or maybe 3. Remember, we're putting this in interval steps, because if someone is maybe at a 1 in a particular competency, do we expect within 30 days that they will be at a level 3? We would like for them to be, but we also want to build in opportunities for folks to achieve success, the same way we would do with clients. So we develop it stepwise so that supervisees have an opportunity to achieve success and feel motivated, hopefully, to continue the work moving forward. Again, I want to circle back to something that Paul said earlier, and something that we need to consistently remember, that regardless as to whether we put the PDP or the professional development plan in place, supervisees still have the choice whether or not they choose to engage in the learning activities or trainings, etc., that we determine might be helpful for them, okay? So of course we have a target date, okay, because this is not forever. So we want to have a target date. And this really, when we go to this, it goes right back to our competencies, the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes. Now, one of the things I just like to remind folks of is that you do not have to have something in every single one of these sections. It is sections. It is very individualized. So it might be knowledge, it might be skills, or it might be attitudes that you and the supervisee have talked about that may need improvement, okay? Of course, we have the goal, which is to be accomplished. Remember, I always like to remind people of the SMART goal. Whatever you're doing, is it specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and there's a time frame. And this is very much the same process. And so the goal, what is to be accomplished, is measurable. Okay, the activities, what will be the activities that will be engaged in, what will be done. So we could necessarily think about training. We could think about peer supervision, where they're connected with a more senior peer who can assist them in developing a competency. All of those things are possibilities, but they also, again, are discussed in the supervisory discussion. Then we talk about the metrics. How will progress be measured? And so, for example, if someone attends a training, one of the things that you might want to think about is them coming back and potentially doing a presentation to the entire staff around what they learned in the training. There are so many different opportunities that you can create for this to happen, okay, and how to be measured. And then we have our target completion date. If you utilize any of the K, the S, or the A's, or all 3, you should definitely be putting in a target completion date. And remember, those target completion dates can be different depending upon what is being discussed and what is being worked on than the target date. The target date of completion is for the entire PDP. The target completion for each section is for that specific section alone, okay? So I think we can take 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, to do a quick exercise around Megan. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And in the chat, Paul has posted or pasted a particular focus for Megan in regards to the competencies that you're looking at in regards to Megan, and they're in the element screening. And I see something in the chat, choose one of the competencies, and you're going to focus on that particular competency. And then you're going to identify a K, an S, or an A. Remember, just one. You choose one competency and one K or S or A to put in your PDP for Megan. Okay. And yes, we will be sending the assignment via email at the end of the training, probably the end of the day or maybe tomorrow. Okay. You're welcome. Okay. So Clyde, can you put folks into groups, same groups that they were in before, but we're going to take a few minutes to just focus on Megan and the one competency. And remember, this is just one competency. This is 1K, S or A, just one. And you're not going to be reporting back on this. This is just for you to practice it, okay?
Dr. Blackwell, how long do you want the breakout group?
Oh, about 10 minutes. But
10 minutes will take us to 1 o'clock, which will be.
So let's do 5 minutes.
Okay. So 5 minutes. And 5 groups, Clyde.
Start seeing folks coming back now.
There's Euban. Excellent.
Yep. Welcome back, folk.
All right. Welcome back, folks. So it's been a whirlwind, and we have attempted to fill every possible moment we could with as much of the rich body of resources that are available in this particular training. Your work is ongoing. You will get a follow-up email that will give you information about how to complete and when to complete the professional development plan assignment that will complete your participation in this course. And what I'm going to ask is if everybody could just take a moment, and just as a way of concluding this part of our being together, if you could think about, this is the 3rd day we've had the opportunity to be in each other's company. And I'm wondering, as you think about that, if there's one word that rises to the top for you about your experience of these 3 days. And your experience. So we're asking you to get in touch with your subjectivity, your experience of these 3 days. If there's one word that you could offer that speaks to or illuminates your experience of these 3 days, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and follow Sam's example and type it into the chat. Because I figure since Sam got up at 4 in the morning, and if she is able to type a word in the chat, maybe other people might be able to follow. And if you get a chance, please do read what people are writing in the chat. I'm seeing them. They're kind of flashing in front of me. It's not like my life flashing in front of me, but it's sort of your experience. Yes. And I know it's hard to limit it to one word, but it can be helpful sometimes to think about that. Yeah. Somebody said that they thought it was a pleasure. I can tell you from my subjective experience, I have so enjoyed being in this learning community with each and every one of you. And I cannot thank you for what you've brought to it, how rich and interesting and provocative you made the conversation. Thank you for that. And I do profoundly hope we will be in future learning communities together. Dr. Blackwell, if there's anything you would like to add or comment about your experience or your takeaway, and then whenever you're ready, if you want to show the last slide so people can complete the evaluation, that would be great.
Absolutely. Just quickly, thank you so very much for the richness of the conversations, the questions that were had in this learning community. And every single time I've done this training, I learned something. And so thank you so very much for providing an opportunity for me to learn something new. And I so appreciate you and appreciate your presence. And I wish you all the much success.
Yes. Thank you.